There is something deeply strange about the history of how we've cared for children. For centuries, some of the biggest advances in child welfare came from a simple realization. There were children who needed help, and their families either couldn't or sometimes wouldn't provide it. An infant had been abandoned. A child was living on the street. A teenager was getting into trouble and seemed headed for somewhere worse. And again, societies responded by building places specifically designed to take those children in. At the time, many of those ideas were genuinely progressive. When abandoned infants were routinely left outside churches or on the street, foundling hospitals offered them food and shelter and a chance to survive. When children accused of crimes were being locked up alongside adult prisoners, reformers created separate institutions where they could be educated instead of simply punished. Later, when families were struggling with addiction, mental illness, or behavior they felt unable to manage, residential programs promised treatment from people trained to help. And many of these places did help. That's important because otherwise, this becomes a very easy story about terrible institutions run by terrible people. And the history is considerably more complicated than that, of course. The reasons children entered these institutions varied enormously. Some arrived because their families were desperately poor, others because disease had taken a parent or left a family unable to provide. Some had committed crimes, while others had been labeled disobedient or wayward or simply impossible to control. Whatever brought them there, the underlying promise was remarkably consistent. Give us responsibility for this child, and we will give them something you cannot. For more than 600 years, parents, courts, churches, and governments accepted that promise. And that's where this story does start to get complicated. Because some of the same institutions created to protect vulnerable children eventually became places where children were neglected, exploited, beaten, isolated, and, in some cases, killed. It happened under different governments and in different centuries, and to children who had been sent away for completely different reasons. Yet when you look closely at how these places actually operated, remarkably similar problems began appearing over and over again. Institutions founded with sincere humanitarian goals accumulated enormous authority over the children inside them. Oversight struggled to keep pace with that authority. So, the question at the center of this episode isn't simply how places created to help children sometimes became places to hurt them. We have plenty of individual scandals that could answer that. The more interesting question is why the conditions that allowed those scandals to happen kept showing up again. Because if the same vulnerabilities appear in a 15th century foundling hospital, a 19th century house of refuge, a 20th century reform school, and a modern residential treatment program, then we're dealing with something much bigger than a collection of bad institutions. We're dealing with a pattern. So let's rewind and let's get into it. For as long as there have been children, there have been children without parents. Long before anyone imagined orphanages or social workers, every society faced the same impossible question: what happens to a child when there's no one left to care for them? For most of history, there wasn't a very satisfying answer. Sometimes relatives stepped in. Sometimes a local church or monastery took a child under its protection. But just as often, survival depended on chance. An abandoned infant might be found by a passing stranger, or not. A hungry child might find work, or starve trying. There was no organized safety net waiting quietly in the background. If families failed, there was rarely another system prepared to catch the children they left behind. Then, during the early years of the Renaissance, something changed. In 1419, construction began on a remarkable building in Florence, Italy, designed by the architect Filippo Brunelleschi. The Ospedale degli Innocenti, the Hospital of the Innocents, still stands today beneath its graceful arcade, overlooking the Piazza della Santissima Annunziata. Visitors often admire it as one of the earliest masterpieces of Renaissance architecture. What many of them don't realize is that it also represents one of the most important turning points in the history of childhood. The building wasn't a hospital in a modern sense. It wasn't built to treat disease or perform surgery. It had one central purpose: to receive children no one else could keep alive. That idea may not sound revolutionary today. We live in a world where governments investigate child abuse and foster families open their homes to children they've never met. And adoption agencies operate in nearly every developed nation. We expect vulnerable children to become society's concern. In the 15th century, that expectation barely existed. The Hospital of the Innocents represented something profoundly new, the belief that abandoned children should not simply depend on private charity or good fortune. They should become the responsibility of an organized institution. It was an extraordinary act of compassion. Parents who arrived there weren't making ordinary parenting decisions. Many were making impossible ones. Imagine a widow with no income after the plague claimed her husband. Imagine a servant dismissed from employment because she became pregnant. Imagine a family already struggling to feed four children through another failed harvest. For some, leaving a child at the hospital wasn't an act of rejection, it was an act of hope. Many parents left small tokens with the infants they surrendered. It was a ribbon or a half a coin, a piece of embroidered cloth, a broken religious medal. The child kept one half, and the parent kept the other. The objects weren't valuable, they were identifiers. A promise that if circumstances somehow improved, months or years later, the two halves could be matched together and a family might be reunited. It's one of the most moving details preserved in the historical record because it reminds us that these children weren't being abandoned by people who didn't care. Not always. Quite often, they were being surrendered by people who cared desperately. That's why historians generally describe institutions like the Hospital of the Innocents as humanitarian achievements. And they should, because they were. The creation of foundling hospitals marked a profound moral shift. Society was beginning to say that vulnerable children deserved more than whatever happened to them by chance. They deserved deliberate care. But every historical breakthrough creates consequences its founders cannot fully anticipate. The moment a child crossed the threshold of the Hospital of the Innocents, something fundamental changed. Responsibility moved from a family to an institution. It was the birth of something that researchers call collective custody. Now, on a scale history had rarely seen before, children entered organizations that assumed nearly complete responsibility for every aspect of their lives. The institution decided who would feed them, who would educate them, whether brothers and sisters stayed together, whether records were carefully preserved, whether a parent returning years later would have any realistic chance of finding the child they had surrendered. In other words, the institution didn't simply provide care, it exercised a lot of authority. That distinction matters because it introduces the central question. When society gives an institution extraordinary authority over children, who watches the institution? It's tempting to assume that this question only became important once stories of abuse began appearing centuries later. The historical evidence suggests otherwise. Some of the earliest problems weren't spectacular scandals. They weren't sadistic wardens or shocking criminal conspiracies. Instead, historians repeatedly point to something quieter and, in many ways, more revealing. There was structural neglect. There were too many children. There were too few caregivers. There was disease spreading through crowded nurseries. Infants received inconsistent substitute care. Institutions grew faster than anyone's ability to supervise them effectively. The uncomfortable truth is that the earliest child serving institutions often accomplished two things at once. They saved children who otherwise might have died, and they created systems in which other children died while under their care. And one of the clearest examples comes from London's Foundling Hospital. By the 19th century, it was widely respected and generally considered better managed than many similar institutions elsewhere in Europe. Yet historical records show that between 1842 and 1867, roughly 3 out of every 10 children admitted to the hospital died while in care. By the end of the century, mortality had fallen to around 10% as conditions improved, and historians caution against treating London's experience as representative of every foundling institution. In fact, many continental institutions appeared to have fared even worse. That statistic isn't important because it tells us the foundling hospital failed, but it's important because it forces us to confront a much harder question. How can an institution created to save children become a place where so many die under its protection? The easiest explanation would be to conclude that these stories are simply the work of exceptionally cruel people. Certainly, history gives us examples of those. Some staff members were unquestionably sadistic, and some committed acts that can only be described as evil. But that explanation isn't large enough to account for what we've seen over the last 600 years. The historical record keeps pointing to a more complicated conclusion. Cruel people did matter, but so did the systems that surrounded them. Again and again, institutions combined compassionate missions with extraordinary authority over children, weak independent oversight, and cultures that made it difficult for children to be heard or believed. Those conditions didn't create abusive people, they created environments in which abusive people could operate for years and sometimes decades without meaningful accountability. And perhaps even more troubling, those same conditions didn't just protect the worst actors, they also made it easier for otherwise decent people to normalize what was happening around them, to defer to authority, or to convince themselves that harsh treatment was simply part of helping difficult children. Organizations created with genuinely benevolent purposes gradually accumulated extraordinary authority over children while operating with limited outside scrutiny. Communication with the outside world was often controlled. Standards became inconsistent. Independent oversight was minimal, and because the institution itself became responsible for nearly every aspect of a child's life, the line between care and custody became increasingly difficult to see. And in one of history's earliest and most compassionate attempts to save abandoned children, that pattern first appears here. As I continued comparing these institutions, I stopped looking at what they called themselves. Instead, I started asking the same 5 questions every time. Who controls the child's daily life? Who can communicate with the child? Who hears complaints? Who inspects the institution? And who decides whether the institution is succeeding or failing? Surprisingly, the answers changed very little over 6 centuries. Now, if Florence introduced the idea that an institution could care for a child when no family could, the 19th century introduced something even more radical. An institution no longer needed to wait until a child was abandoned. It could intervene because adults believed the child needed to be changed. That distinction reshaped child welfare for generations. By the 1820s, New York City barely resembled the city it had been a few decades earlier. Ships arrived daily carrying immigrants looking for opportunity. Streets that had once held modest homes became crowded tenements. Disease spread quickly through neighborhoods where entire families lived in a single room, and children were everywhere. Some sold newspapers before sunrise. Others shined shoes outside hotels or unloaded cargo along the docks. Many worked 12-hour days in factories. Others never found work at all. Visitors to the city often remarked on the number of children living almost entirely on their own. Contemporary newspapers described gangs of boys roaming lower Manhattan, sleeping in abandoned buildings, stealing food, and occasionally appearing before judges alongside adult criminals. Like most newspaper accounts, some of the stories were undoubtedly exaggerated, but enough were true to convince reformers that something had to change. It's worth pausing here because it's easy to misunderstand what happened next. The people trying to solve this problem weren't arguing for harsher punishment. It was quite the opposite, really. They believed children deserved something better than adult prisons. If you ever heard the phrase, children are different, this is one of the moments where American law began taking that idea seriously. In 1825, New York opened the House of Refuge. Today, historians routinely describe it as America's first juvenile reformatory. But to understand why it mattered, it's helpful to think of it less as a prison and more of an experiment. Its founders believed childhood itself could be redirected. Take a child away from the influences corrupting them, surround them with discipline, and teach them religion and teach them a trade. Replace disorder with routine. Replace idleness with work. Replace vice with virtue, and return them to society as different people. It's difficult to criticize that ambition. In fact, much of it sounds pretty modern. Even today, most of us would rather rehabilitate a 14-year-old than imprison one. The House of Refuge represented one of the earliest large-scale attempts to do exactly that, which makes what happened so important. The institution didn't stay reserved for children convicted of serious crimes. It couldn't. If its mission was prevention, then reformers had to intervene before children became hardened criminals. And once prevention became the goal, the definition of who belonged inside began to expand. Court records and admission registers tell an interesting story. Some children had stolen or committed burglary, and some had been arrested repeatedly, but many had not. Children were committed for truancy, for running away, or begging, or vagrancy. Girls could be institutionalized for behavior authorities considered sexually improper or morally dangerous. Others arrived because parents insisted they had become impossible to control. One word appears over and over again in 19th century records: incorrigible. It's fascinating because it isn't really a legal category. It's a judgment. It doesn't describe what a child did. It describes what adults thought about the child. It could have meant that they were stubborn or disobedient or defiant, ultimately beyond correction. The more I read 19th century records, the more I realized how powerful that single word had become. Once a child was labeled incorrigible, the conversation often shifted away from what happened to what might happen if no one intervened. In other words, institutions increasingly justified confinement, not because of proven criminal conduct, but because of predicted failures. And no case illustrates that transition more clearly than Mary Ann Krause. In 1838, Mary Ann's mother petitioned to have her daughter committed to Philadelphia's House of Refuge. We don't know every detail of their family life, and historians are careful not to speculate beyond the surviving record. But what we do know is striking enough. Mary Ann had not been convicted of a crime. Her mother argued instead that her daughter had become unmanageable and that commitment would ultimately be for her own good. The case reached Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and you might expect the judges to ask the obvious question, what law did this girl break? Instead, the court focused on an entirely different question. Did the state have the authority to remove a child from her family, not to punish her for a crime, but because officials believed they could provide a better upbringing? The court answered yes. In one of the most influential juvenile law decisions of the 19th century, the judges relied on the doctrine of parens patriae, literally parent of the nation. The opinion argued that the state possessed both the authority and the obligation to intervene when doing so would promote the child's welfare. The House of Refuge, the court wrote, wasn't a prison, it was a school. That sentence deserves to linger for a moment, because it transformed everything. If the institution wasn't punishment, then many of the legal protections associated with punishment no longer applied. A child could lose their freedom without a criminal conviction, without a jury trial, without many of the procedural safeguards adults had expected for themselves. The institution wasn't understood as taking liberty. It was understood as giving opportunity. And that legal shift is one of the most consequential developments in the history of child welfare. Florence had introduced collective custody. The House of Refuge dramatically expanded who could be placed into that custody. And once children entered these institutions, another pattern from earlier quietly returned. Who determined whether the institution itself was succeeding? Inspectors visited from time to time, yes. Boards of managers issued reports, and judges reviewed cases, but the people living inside the institution occupied the weakest position in the entire system. Think about that for just a moment. A child is admitted because adults believe they're dishonest, or defiant, or morally wayward. If that same child later tells adults they're being mistreated, what happens? The historical record suggests an uncomfortable answer. The label often followed them. Complaints could be interpreted as manipulation. Resistance could be viewed as proof the institution's discipline was necessary. Attempts to escape became evidence that reform had not yet succeeded. Long before psychologists gave it a name, the House of Refuge had stumbled into what researchers today would recognize as a credibility trap. The institution defined the child, and once they had done that, it became easier for them to believe the definition than the child. That mechanism would prove really durable, because by the 20th century, it wouldn't simply shape how children entered institutions. It shaped what happened after they began telling the outside world what life inside those institutions was actually like. By the time the Florida School for Boys opened its doors in 1900, the basic idea behind institutions for children had become deeply embedded in American life. The names were different, sure, but the underlying promise had hardly changed at all. Take children who appear headed toward difficult lives, remove them from unhealthy environments, and surround them with discipline and structure. Return them to society better than they arrived. The Florida School for Boys, later known simply as Dozier, was created in that tradition. To many Floridians, it represented progress, reform instead of imprisonment, opportunity instead of abandonment, another chance for boys who had wandered into trouble before adulthood had fully taken hold. If you've been listening from the beginning, that language probably sounds familiar. We've heard versions of it for nearly 500 years. The institution exists to help, and the adults are acting in the child's best interests. So trust the institution, right? But for decades, that's exactly what Florida did. And almost immediately, children began saying something was terribly wrong. One of the easiest mistakes we can make when looking backwards is imagining that Dozier's abuses remained hidden until modern investigators uncovered them. But that's not what happened. Rumors surfaced almost immediately. State inspections raised concerns within the school's first years of operation. Newspapers occasionally reported allegations of harsh punishment. Parents complained. Boys ran away. Some returned home describing beatings so severe that family members scarcely believed them. Legislative committees periodically investigated conditions. Administrators were replaced. Policies were rewritten. Yet the institution remained. And not just for a few years, decade after decade. Why did the institution survive for more than a century despite repeated warnings? Part of the answer sat in the middle of the campus. The boys called it the White House. It wasn't white because it symbolized purity or hope. It was simply a small white building where punishments were carried out. If you read survivor testimony today, one thing becomes immediately striking. People might remember different things like the staff members or just different various details, but they remember that building with extraordinary consistency. Former students describe being taken inside, ordered over a cot, and whipped with a heavy leather strap. Some remembered hearing the blows before they experienced them themselves. Others remembered waiting outside and counting the strikes, trying to guess whose turn would come next. Many thought they would not walk back out. One survivor, James Turk Smith, later recalled hearing boys scream from inside the building while everyone else pretended not to notice. Another remembered blood on the mattresses. Others described being warned never to speak about what happened there once they returned to the dormitories. Whether every memory is identical isn't really the point. The crazy thing is how many men, many of whom had never met after leaving the school, spent decades describing the same thing. The same routines and the same fear and the same silence. And here's where the pattern is. The boys told people. They told parents. They wrote letters, and some escaped and described what happened. The adults simply found the institution more credible. Think about it from the perspective of a Florida legislator in the 30s or 40s. On one side stands the superintendent of a state institution. He's educated and respected. The governor appointed him. Local judges send boys to a school because the state believes he knows how to reform them. On the other side stands a 14-year-old who has already been labeled delinquent. Who are you more likely to believe? It's an uncomfortable question. It's also the same credibility problem we first encountered in the House of Refuge. The historical research repeatedly points to this as one of the most important structural weaknesses in child-serving institutions. And Dozier demonstrates what happens when an institution accumulates enough credibility that repeated warnings cease to produce meaningful accountability. And eventually, time did something no investigation had managed to do. It created witnesses. The boys grew up, and beginning in the late 20th century, former students started finding one another. Many had carried these memories in silence for decades, convinced no one would ever believe them. They called themselves the White House Boys. At first, skeptics questioned whether memory could really remain reliable after so many years. And that's a fair question. Memory can fade, stories can change, and people can influence one another. But something happened that changed the conversation. Archaeologists from the University of South Florida began investigating the school grounds. For years, a small cemetery known as Boot Hill sat on the school's property with 31 white crosses, seemingly marking the children buried there, except the crosses hadn't been placed when the boys died. They were added ceremonially in the 1990s, decades later, and they didn't actually correspond to the locations of individual graves. When researchers from the university began surveying the ground, the numbers stopped making sense. A 2009 state investigation had reported 31 children buried at the school. Archaeologists eventually located 55 grave shafts, 24 more than the official record indicated should have been there. Those graves contained the remains of 51 individuals, including burned and commingled remains associated with the deadly 1914 fire. And then they started giving some of those remains their names back. One of them belonged to a 14-year-old boy named George Owen Smith. George had been sent to the school in 1940 and never came home. That December, his mother wrote to the superintendent asking where her son was. The answer she received was extraordinary. The institution responsible for George told his mother that it didn't know where he was. More than 70 years later, archaeologists found George's remains in an unmarked grave on the school's property, wrapped only in a burial shroud. DNA provided by his surviving sister finally identified him. Researchers would go on to identify other children as well, including 13-year-old Thomas Vernado and 12-year-old Earl Wilson. And suddenly, the story of Dozier wasn't resting solely on memories carried by elderly men describing what had happened to them as boys. There was physical evidence beneath the ground, an official burial count that did not match what the archaeologists found, and families who had spent decades without knowing where their children had been buried. Now, the archaeology didn't prove every allegation made over the previous century. History, of course, wouldn't be that convenient. What it did prove was something just as important, though. The survivors hadn't imagined the institution, and they had not invented the suffering. Now, I want to take a quick pit stop here because I could not go on without mentioning this. If this part of the story is sticking with you, there is a book that I highly recommend called The Reformatory by Tanana Reeve Dew. I read this book last year, and honestly, it is one of those books that has stayed with me, like, in a way that very few books do. It is a historical fiction, so I wanna be clear that I'm not using it as evidence for what happened at Dozier, but the story takes place at essentially a fictional reform school in the Jim Crow era Florida, and it includes supernatural elements too, so it's a little different. But the author drew heavily from the history of Dozier, and the connection is really personal for her because her own great uncle, Robert Stevens, died at Dozier in 1937 when he was just 15 years old. And what the novel does really well is put you inside the experience of being a child in a place like that, where you feel the isolation and the constant calculation of which adults can be trusted, and the fear of punishment, and the racial hierarchy, and the terrifying realization that the people who control almost every aspect of your life also control much of what the outside world knows about your life. After reading the testimony and the investigations into Dozier, there were just so many moments when I found myself thinking back to that book. So 10 out of 10, amazing read. I just wanted to give you a little recommendation. So moving on, if Dozier had marked the end of this history, we could tell ourselves that society eventually learned its lesson, right? That would be great. It would be great to say that reform schools belonged to another era and that we finally recognize the dangers of giving institutions so much unchecked authority over children. But institutions rarely disappear, and more often they just reinvent themselves. And in the second half of the 20th century, something interesting happened. America stopped talking about reform and started talking about treatment. By the middle of the 20th century, something important began to change outside of the institutions. For centuries, the institution itself had largely been presumed to be acting in a child's best interest. That assumption slowly began to break down. Why? Well, because of history. By the middle of the 20th century, too many investigations had reached too many familiar conclusions. Stories that had once been dismissed as isolated scandals were beginning to look a lot less isolated. Historians and social workers and pediatricians and lawmakers all increasingly recognize that children could be harmed not only by families, but also by the institutions created to protect them. That realization transformed child welfare. In Britain, one of the most significant milestones came with the Children Act of 1948, passed in the aftermath of the death of 13-year-old Dennis O'Neill, a foster child whose abuse exposed profound weaknesses in their child welfare system. The act reorganized government responsibility for children who had been deprived of what lawmakers called a normal home life. It reflected a growing consensus that large residential institutions should no longer be viewed as the default solution. Whenever possible, children should grow up in families rather than institutions. That represented a significant reversal. 5 centuries earlier, institutional care had been celebrated as one of society's greatest humanitarian innovations. Now governments were beginning to ask whether institutions should be the last option rather than the first. The United States reached a similar turning point a generation later. In 1974, Congress passed the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, better known as CAPTA. For the first time, child abuse and neglect became matters of national policy rather than problems left almost entirely to individual states and local communities. Federal funding became tied to systems for reporting abuse, investing allegations, and protecting children. Looking back across the first three parts of this episode, it's really difficult to overstate what a profound change this represented. For centuries, institutions largely were their own judges. Now, governments expected institutions to answer to someone else. Children today possess legal protections that simply did not exist during the eras of the Foundling Hospital or the House of Refuge, or even Dozier. Residential facilities are generally subject to licensing requirements. Staff members in most settings are mandatory reporters. Courts recognize children's rights in ways previous centuries never imagined. History essentially learned, at least partially, because while researching the present day, I kept encountering something that felt pretty familiar: the oversight part. One of the more surprising findings came from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Researchers examining residential treatment programs for children found that regulation varied enormously depending on what type of facility a child entered and where the facility happened to be located. Mental health residential treatment programs, for example, were often subject to different and, in some cases, weaker oversight than comparable substance abuse treatment facilities. In several states, officials reported difficulty determining something that sounds almost impossible in 2026. They couldn't confidently identify every residential facility operating under their authority. Think about that. There's still places where governments struggle to answer a remarkably basic question: who exactly is caring for these children? Another federal review reached an equally unsettling conclusion. Nearly one-third of states were unable to identify patterns of maltreatment occurring within residential facilities serving children in foster care. That finding gets us much closer to the real problem, because by the 21st century, saying these institutions simply lacked oversight isn't necessarily the whole story. There is oversight. There are licensing agencies and child protection departments, mandatory reporting laws, and police departments and health departments, and federal funding requirements. There's accreditation organizations and even inspectors. The more revealing question is how a child can exist inside all of those layers of protection and still fall through them. One answer is surprisingly mundane: the information doesn't always meet the same place. A residential psychiatric facility may answer to one regulatory agency, while a therapeutic boarding school may fall into another category entirely. A wilderness program can be regulated differently again. Federal requirements that apply to a Medicaid-funded psychiatric residential treatment facility don't necessarily apply to a privately funded boarding school that also advertises behavioral treatment. And if a child from Georgia is sent by their parents to a program in Utah, the people who know the family, the people regulating the facility, and the people paying for the care may all be operating in different systems. That means a program doesn't necessarily have to hide every problem for a pattern to remain invisible. One regulator might know about an injury, another agency might receive an abuse complaint. Police might investigate an incident without filing charges. A licensing inspector might cite a staffing problem, and another facility owned by the same company might have similar complaints in another state. Individually, each event can look like an incident. Unless someone has the ability to pull all of that information together, you can see a smaller scale version of it in ordinary daycare centers. When a daycare worker is caught on camera striking a toddler or kicking a child or forcefully restraining one, or leaving children dangerously unsupervised, the obvious question is how someone capable of doing that was allowed around children in the first place. Sometimes the answer is that nobody knew, but other cases reveal something more complicated: previous complaints that didn't result in charges, licensing violations that were corrected and closed, coworkers who witnessed concerning behavior but didn't report it, or an employee who left one child care setting and went somewhere else. And daycare actually helps illustrate why our modern protections, while enormously better than anything that existed at Dozier, still have limits. A criminal background check can tell an employer what someone has previously been caught and convicted of. It can't identify every person who has behaved abusively without being prosecuted. And residential treatment adds another complication because the people responsible for evaluating the institution may be receiving very different versions of what's happening inside it. That became impossible to ignore when Paris Hilton began publicly describing what she says happened to her as a teenager. Hilton was 17 when her parents sent her to Provo Canyon School in Utah. She has testified that she was taken from her home in the middle of the night by men hired to transport her, brought to residential programs without her consent, and eventually placed at Provo Canyon, where she had alleged physical and psychological abuse, forced medication, isolation, and other mistreatment. Provo Canyon's current ownership has said the school changed ownership after Hilton attended, and that it therefore cannot comment on treatment provided during that earlier period. Whenever someone thinks of Paris Hilton as a celebrity is almost besides the point. What makes her useful to the story is that she eventually acquired something most children inside institutions don't have: an enormous microphone. When she testified before Congress in 2024, she described the experience of telling her parents she was being mistreated and not being believed. She said they'd been told that attempts to leave or complaints about the program were part of the behavior they were trying to correct. And there's the credibility trap from the House of Refuge, now operating in the language of treatment. A child doesn't even have to be explicitly called a liar. The adults simply need another explanation for what the child is saying. She's manipulating you. He's resisting treatment. She's trying to get sent home. He's testing the boundaries. The institution now possesses something enormously valuable: an explanation for the evidence against itself. That helps explain how coercive practices can survive even when adults genuinely believe they're helping. If a teenager describes an experience as isolation, and the program describes it as therapeutic separation, those aren't simply two different words. They're competing interpretations of the same event. If exhausting physical activity is described as resilience building, confrontation as therapy, or restrictions on communication as necessary to prevent manipulation, the argument is no longer necessarily over whether the practice occurred. It's over what the practice means. And the adult outside the institution has to decide which interpretation to trust. That problem became difficult to dismiss as a collection of survivor stories when Congress began looking at the industry more broadly. In 2007, the Government Accountability Office investigated private residential programs for young people and found thousands of allegations of abuse and neglect and deaths reported between 1990 and 2007. But GAO couldn't produce a definitive national total because there was no single comprehensive source collecting the information. 17 years later, the Senate Finance Committee released the results of a 2-year investigation into 4 large companies operating residential treatment facilities for children. Its title was not subtle. It was called Warehouses of Neglect. Investigators described physical and sexual abuse, inappropriate restraint and seclusion, inadequate behavioral health treatment, unsafe conditions, and death. The community's conclusion was that these weren't simply isolated incidents produced by a few rogue employees. It identified systemic problems in the way residential treatment was financed and staffed and monitored and regulated. And this is where the timeline becomes difficult to ignore. Federal investigators raised alarms in 2007. Survivors continued speaking publicly. Programs did close and lawsuits were filed. Congress did hold hearings, and Hilton and other survivors pushed the issue into mainstream public view. Then, in 2024, federal investigators were still reporting that some states lacked the information necessary to identify patterns of maltreatment. That doesn't mean nothing changed during these 17 years. Quite a lot actually did. Federal policy has increasingly pushed foster care systems away from congregate care. The number of foster youth whose most recent placement was a residential facility fell from roughly 101,000 in 2002 to about 34,000 in 2022. The Family First Prevention Services Act also placed new restrictions on federal funding for long-term congregate placements and imposed additional requirements on certain residential treatment settings. In 2024, Congress passed the Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act, requiring additional national research and data collection and recommendations concerning youth residential programs. Those are substantial reforms, but they also reveal why this problem has been so stubborn. There isn't really one troubled teen industry for government to regulate. There are psychiatric residential treatment facilities and residential treatment centers, therapeutic boarding schools and wilderness programs and group homes and substance use programs and juvenile justice placements and private programs whose legal classification can determine which rules apply to them. A child may have extensive federal protections in one type of facility and significantly fewer in another. That, from a parent's perspective, appears to offer a strikingly similar promise. So, if you're a parent today trying to determine what protections your child would have in a residential treatment, the frustrating answer is it depends on what the program legally is. And I think that distinction finally gets us closer to answering the question we started with. For 600 years, the recurring failure hasn't simply been that society forgot to supervise institutions. We repeatedly did supervise them. The harder problem is what happens between those interventions. It's the complaint that looks isolated because the regulator can't see the complaints in another state, or the employee whose behavior was concerning but never resulted in a conviction that would appear on a background check. And then there's one final reason these systems keep returning that has nothing to do with regulation. We still need them. They're children whose psychiatric needs can't be safely managed at home. There are children whose parents have died, and children who have been abused, children committing serious crimes, and children whose families are desperate for help that ordinary schools and doctors and community programs haven't been able to provide. That demand is real, and that means the promise made by the Hospital of the Innocents never entirely disappeared. Give us responsibility for this child, and we will provide something that you cannot. Sometimes that promise is kept. Sometimes an institution really does save a child's life, and that may be precisely why this history has been so difficult to solve. The danger isn't simply that no one is watching, it's that everyone can be watching one small part and still miss what's happening to the child in the middle. Thanks for listening to this again. I really do want to thank you. And I know there's only 24 hours in the day, and I am so appreciative that you choose to spend 30 to 45 minutes of your time listening to this show. So truly, I really thank you. And while I still have you, of course, please rate and review if you haven't done so. It really, really helps the algorithm and for people to find me when there's more engagement. So consider doing that if you have an extra moment. And sharing this with a friend probably wouldn't hurt either. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.